October 14, 1943, 27,000 feet above Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. Flight Petty Officer Takeo Tanimizu pulled his Mitsubishi A6M Zero into a climbing attack position, lining up his gun sight on the massive four-engine bomber ahead. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress flew straight and level, seemingly unaware of the danger approaching from below and behind. Tanimizu had shot down 6 Allied aircraft in the previous 8 months. He understood exactly how to kill these heavy bombers. Close to within 200 yards, aim for the engines or fuel tanks, a short burst of 20mm cannon fire. Watch the American bomber catch fire and fall. He had done it twice before against B-17s earlier in 1943, but today something would be fundamentally different. Something that Tanimizu and his fellow pilots had dismissed as American cowardice and technological desperation. As his finger pressed the firing button and tracers reached toward the B-17, what happened next would shatter every assumption Japanese naval aviation held about bomber combat. The bullets struck the B-17 squarely along the fuselage and wings. Tanimizu saw the impacts clearly. But the bomber did not catch fire. It did not trail smoke. It did not falter. Instead, from 5 different positions on the B-17, tracers suddenly reached back toward Tanimizu's Zero. 5 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. Over 3,000 rounds per minute converging on his lightweight fighter. The first rounds punched through the Zero's thin aluminum skin like tissue paper. The second burst shredded his left aileron. The third burst struck his engine, and Tanimizu's world exploded in a spray of oil and flames. He barely managed to bail out at 25,000 feet, pulling his ripcord as his Zero tumbled toward the ocean, trailing black smoke. As he descended slowly under his parachute, watching other Zeros pressing attacks against the B-17 formation, only to be shot down one after another by concentrated defensive fire, Tanimizu understood with terrible clarity that Japanese fighter doctrine had catastrophically underestimated what American engineers had achieved. The mathematics of air combat were being rewritten not through superior maneuverability or speed, but through armor protection that kept American bombers flying and firing long enough to destroy their attackers. The transformation had begun 3 years earlier in engineering offices where American designers confronted an uncomfortable truth about bomber vulnerability. September 1940. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Colonel Carl Green examined combat reports from the Battle of Britain with growing concern. RAF bomber losses were catastrophic. Wellington, Blenheim, and Hampton bombers were being shot down by German fighters at unsustainable rates. The reports described bombers bursting into flames from single hits to fuel tanks. Crews killed instantly when bullets penetrated cockpits. Aircraft falling apart when control cables were severed by machine gun fire. The British were losing bombers faster than factories could replace them. More critically, they were losing trained crews whose experience could never be replaced. Green understood that American heavy bombers under development would face identical threats. The B-17 Flying Fortress, just entering production, carried massive bomb loads deep into enemy territory. But what good was payload capacity if the aircraft couldn't survive long enough to deliver its bombs and return home? The strategic bombing doctrine that American air power advocates had championed for 2 decades assumed that heavily armed bombers in tight formation could fight their way to targets and back without fighter escort. This assumption required bombers to absorb punishment and keep fighting, yet the aircraft being produced offered minimal protection. The Boeing Aircraft Company had designed the B-17 primarily for speed, altitude, and defensive armament. The aircraft bristled with machine guns in various positions, The B-17D model carried 7 50 caliber or 30 caliber machine guns operated by crew members, but the aircraft itself offered minimal protection to its crew or vital systems. Fuel tanks were standard aluminum construction. A single incendiary round could ignite hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline, turning the bomber into a fireball. The cockpit featured ordinary plexiglass windows. Machine gun bullets passed through them effortlessly, killing pilots and co-pilots. Control cables ran exposed through the fuselage. One burst of cannon fire could sever them, rendering the aircraft uncontrollable. Crew positions throughout the aircraft lacked any armor protection. Gunners operating the dorsal, ventral, and waist positions were completely exposed to enemy fire. A single bullet could kill them instantly. The vulnerability was not theoretical. It was documented in blood across European skies every day throughout 1940 and early 1941. Colonel Green convened a meeting of Army Air Corps engineering officers and Boeing representatives in October 1940. The topic was bomber survivability. The solution seemed obvious. Add armor plating to protect crew and critical systems, but the implementation proved extraordinarily complex. Adding armor meant adding weight. The B-17D already weighed 48,000 pounds fully loaded. Every additional pound of armor reduced bomb load, fuel capacity, or range. The aircraft was already operating near its maximum gross weight limits. Adding thousands of pounds of armor plating threatened to make the aircraft unable to reach its performance specifications. Boeing engineers argued that armor would reduce speed and altitude performance, making bombers more vulnerable rather than less. They advocated instead for better defensive armament and tighter formation flying. Army Air Corps officers, influenced by strategic bombing doctrine that assumed bombers could fight their way through without fighter escort, initially agreed. The B-17 would rely on speed, altitude, and defensive firepower rather than passive armor protection. This decision reflected broader American military aviation philosophy in 1940. American aircraft designers prioritized performance over protection. Fighter aircraft were designed for maximum speed and maneuverability with minimal armor. Bomber aircraft were designed for maximum payload and range with minimal protection. This philosophy made sense in peacetime testing but proved catastrophic in combat. The wake-up call came from an unexpected source. Claire Chennault, a retired U.S. Army Air Corps officer working as an aviation advisor to the Chinese nationalist government, sent detailed reports to Washington in late 1940 describing air combat against Japanese forces. Chennault's reports documented how Japanese Zero fighters, extremely maneuverable but lightly constructed with no armor protection, achieved remarkable kill ratios against Chinese aircraft. But the reports also noted that when Chinese or Soviet fighters managed to hit Zeros, single bullets often caused catastrophic damage. The Zero's complete lack of armor protection meant that any hit to the fuel tank, engine, or pilot proved immediately fatal. Chennault argued that armor protection, while adding weight, dramatically increased aircraft survivability in actual combat conditions. The Army Air Corps studied Chennault's reports with interest but took no immediate action. American aircraft designers remained confident that their approach of emphasizing performance over protection was superior. This confidence would be shattered by events over the next year. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The Japanese attack demonstrated with brutal clarity the vulnerability of unarmored aircraft. American fighters caught on the ground or taking off were shot down easily. The few that managed to engage Japanese attackers found their 30 and 50 caliber machine guns capable of damaging Zero fighters, but Japanese pilots frequently continued fighting even after taking multiple hits because American ammunition lacked incendiary capability to reliably ignite fuel tanks. More critically, the handful of American aircraft that survived Japanese attacks and returned fire discovered that Japanese fighters, while deadly when attacking, were extraordinarily fragile when hit. A single burst that connected would often send a Zero down in flames or cause catastrophic structural failure. The Zero's complete absence of armor protection, pilot armor, or self-sealing fuel tanks made it vulnerable to damage that more robust aircraft would shrug off. But American aircraft suffered from similar vulnerabilities. B-17s stationed at Hickam Field and Clark Field in the Philippines were destroyed on the ground or shot down while attempting to evacuate. The few that engaged in early combat missions against Japanese forces discovered that while their defensive armament could damage attacking fighters, the B-17s themselves caught fire, easily when hit. Fuel tanks ignited, crew members were killed, control systems failed. The bombers that had been designed to fight their way through enemy defenses proved far more fragile than doctrine assumed. By January 1942, combat reports from the Philippines, Java, and Australia painted a grim picture. American bombers were suffering unsustainable losses. Japanese fighters pressed attacks to point-blank range, firing their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns with devastating effect. B-17s returned to base with dead crew members, shattered control systems, and holes punched through fuel tanks that had drained away their gasoline during the return flight. Some bombers didn't return at all, shot down by fighters or forced to ditch when damaged fuel tanks left them unable to reach friendly airfields. The strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to win the war couldn't proceed if bombers couldn't survive long enough to deliver their ordnance. The Army Air Forces, reorganized from the Army Air Corps in June 1941, faced a crisis. In February 1942, the AAF ordered immediate implementation of armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks for all bomber aircraft. The modifications would be incorporated into new production aircraft and retrofitted to existing bombers as they cycled through maintenance depots. The engineering challenge was substantial. Armor plating sufficient to stop rifle caliber and light cannon fire weighed approximately 1 pound per square foot for quarter-inch steel plate. Protecting all crew positions, vital systems, and fuel tanks would require adding several thousand pounds to each aircraft. Boeing engineers worked frantically through February and March 1942, designing armor packages that would provide maximum protection for minimum weight. The solution involved strategic placement rather than comprehensive coverage. Complete armor protection was impossible given weight constraints. Instead, engineers identified critical areas where armor would provide the greatest survivability improvement. The pilot and co-pilot seats received heavy armor plate behind them, protecting against attacks from directly behind and below. Quarter-inch steel plate formed a protective barrier that would stop 7.7mm and even 20mm rounds at most combat ranges. Additional armor protected the sides of the cockpit, though forward vision panels remained unarmored plexiglass by necessity. The top turret gunner, the most exposed crew member, received armor plating around his position to protect against attacks from above and to the sides. The radio operator's position received overhead armor to protect against attacks from above. The waist gunners and tail gunner received armor plating behind them and to the sides, creating protective barriers against the attacks from the rear quarter that would be most common. Engine nacelles received armor plating around vital components, including oil coolers and magnetos, protecting against the common fighter tactic of targeting engines. But the most critical modification involved fuel tanks. The B-17E model, entering production in September 1941, carried approximately 2,520 gallons of fuel in wing tanks. These tanks were simple aluminum structures. A single incendiary round could ignite the fuel, and even non-incendiary rounds could puncture tanks, causing fuel to drain away. The solution was self-sealing fuel tanks, a British innovation that American engineers adapted and improved. Self-sealing fuel tanks used multiple layers of rubber and fabric to line the interior of the fuel cell. When a bullet or shell fragment punctured the tank, fuel leaking through the hole would cause the rubber layers to swell and seal the puncture automatically. The system wasn't perfect. Large holes from cannon shells might not seal completely. Multiple hits could overwhelm the self-sealing capability. But against typical fighter armament at typical combat ranges, self-sealing tanks dramatically reduced the probability of catastrophic fuel fires. The self-sealing system added approximately 750 pounds to the B-17's weight. Combined with armor plating protecting crew positions and vital systems, the total weight addition exceeded 2,500 pounds. This represented over 5% of the B-17E's maximum gross weight. The performance impact was measurable. Maximum speed decreased by approximately 8 mph. Service ceiling decreased by approximately 2,000 feet. Range decreased by approximately 200 miles when carrying full bomb loads, but the survivability improvement was dramatic and immediately apparent in combat operations. The B-17E model, incorporating armor and self-sealing tanks, began reaching combat units in the Pacific in April 1942 and in Europe in July 1942. The contrast with earlier models was stark. B-17Ds and earlier variants continued suffering heavy losses when they encountered enemy fighters. B-17Es absorbed punishment and kept flying. The first major test came in August 1942 when the 97th Bombardment Group, flying B-17Es, conducted bombing missions against German-occupied targets in France from bases in England. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17Es bombed the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in the first American heavy bomber mission against occupied Europe. German fighters intercepted the formation, pressing attacks with the aggressive tactics that had proven devastating against unarmored RAF bombers. The American bombers took hits. Crew members watched as cannon shells struck their aircraft. But the B-17Es didn't catch fire. Fuel tanks sealed themselves after being punctured. Armor plating stopped bullets that would have killed crew members or destroyed vital systems. The bombers maintained formation, their defensive guns continuing to fire, forcing German fighters to break off attacks. All 12 B-17s returned to base, some heavily damaged, but none lost. Damage assessment revealed the effectiveness of armor protection. Multiple aircraft had taken hits that would have been fatal to earlier models. One B-17 had armor plating behind the pilot's seat that had stopped 3 20mm cannon shells, any one of which would have killed the pilot in an unarmored aircraft. Another had taken a burst of machine gun fire through the radio operator's compartment that struck armor plating, protecting the radio operator, who was shaken but uninjured. Several aircraft had self-sealing fuel tanks that had been punctured multiple times but sealed successfully, preventing fuel loss and fire. German fighter pilots reported their frustration in debriefings after the mission. They had pressed attacks to point-blank range, firing accurately and observing hits, but the American bombers refused to go down. Attacks that should have set bombers on fire merely damaged them. Attacks that should have killed crew members seemed ineffective. The Luftwaffe initially attributed this to poor marksmanship or ammunition problems, not understanding that American bombers had fundamentally changed the survivability equation. The pattern repeated through fall 1942 as American bomber operations expanded. Missions to targets in occupied France encountered increasingly aggressive German fighter opposition. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s attacked with 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns, pressing attacks with the determination of pilots who understood that stopping American bomber formations was essential to defending German-occupied territory. The bombers took hits. Some were shot down when concentrated fire overwhelmed their armor protection or when fighters attacked from angles where armor coverage was insufficient. But the loss rates remained acceptable. For every bomber shot down, 10 or 15 returned damaged but intact, their crews alive, and their critical systems protected by armor that absorbed punishment. But the transformation was even more dramatic in the Pacific theater, where Japanese fighter opposition followed fundamentally different patterns than German attacks. Japanese pilots had been taught to press attacks to extremely close range, often within 100 yards or less, where their relatively light armament would be most effective. Zero fighters carried two 20mm cannons with limited ammunition and two 7.7mm machine guns. Japanese doctrine emphasized precision shooting at close range rather than standing off and firing from safer distances. This aggressive close-range attack doctrine had proven devastatingly effective against unarmored Allied aircraft in the early months of the war. Chinese, Dutch, British, and American fighters and bombers with minimal or no armor protection were shot down in droves by Japanese pilots who pressed attacks to point-blank range and fired with extraordinary accuracy. But against armored B-17s, the Japanese close-range attack doctrine became a death trap. Japanese pilots approaching to within 100 yards of B-17 formations found themselves not attacking vulnerable targets but flying directly into a hurricane of defensive fire. The B-17E carried 11 50-caliber machine guns in various positions, including 2 each in the top turret, ball turret, nose, and tail, plus single guns in the radio compartment and waist positions. At ranges under 200 yards, multiple gunners could engage a single attacking fighter simultaneously, creating a concentration of fire that few aircraft could survive. October 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. The Japanese naval air base at Rabaul represented one of the most heavily defended targets in the Pacific. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft, including Zero fighters and Betty bombers, operated from multiple airfields surrounding the harbor. The base supported Japanese operations across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, making it a critical strategic objective. 5th Air Force Commander General George Kenney decided that B-17s would attack Rabaul directly, despite the certain heavy fighter opposition. If the bombers could suppress Japanese air operations from Rabaul, Allied forces advancing through New Guinea would face reduced air attacks. The missions would be dangerous. Japanese fighters would outnumber the attacking bombers by factors of 10 to 1 or more, but Kenney believed that properly armored B-17s in tight defensive formation could survive and deliver their bombs. The first major raid occurred on October 12, 1943. 90 Japanese fighters intercepted the attacking B-17s, pressing attacks with suicidal determination. The air battle lasted nearly 30 minutes from initial contact to the bombers' departure from the target area. Flight Petty Officer Takeo Tanimizu, among the intercepting Zero pilots, executed the standard Japanese fighter attack doctrine. He approached from below and behind at high speed, closing to within 150 yards before opening fire. His 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns fired accurately. He observed hits on the B-17's fuselage and wings. In previous attacks against unarmored bombers, this would have resulted in fire, structural failure, or crew casualties that would have forced the bomber out of formation where it could be finished off by follow-up attacks. Instead, Tanimizu's target continued flying straight and level, its guns firing continuously. The armor plating that American engineers had installed absorbed his 20mm cannon shells without allowing them to penetrate to vital systems or crew positions. The self-sealing fuel tanks sealed the punctures his rounds had made, preventing fuel from igniting or draining away. As Tanimizu climbed away to reposition for another attack, multiple 50-caliber machine gun streams from different positions on the B-17 converged on his Zero. The thin aluminum skin of his fighter offered no protection whatsoever. Rounds punched through his wings, fuselage, and engine. His aircraft was literally being torn apart by concentrated defensive fire from a target that refused to die. Tanimizu barely escaped, his Zero trailing smoke and oil, forcing him to ditch in the harbor where he was rescued by float plane. His aircraft was a total loss. More importantly, his experience was not unique. Across the formation, Japanese pilots were discovering that their attacks, executed perfectly according to doctrine, were not producing the expected results. Bombers that should have been easy, kills absorbed damage and kept flying. Worse, the concentration of defensive fire from B-17 formations proved far more lethal than Japanese intelligence had anticipated. Multiple gun positions firing simultaneously created a deadly crossfire that caught Japanese fighters as they pressed close-range attacks. October 14, 1943, saw an even larger air battle over Rabaul. 120 Japanese fighters intercepted the attacking B-17 formations. The resulting combat demonstrated conclusively that armor protection had fundamentally altered the tactical balance between bombers and fighters. B-17 gunners, protected by armor plating that kept them alive and fighting even when their aircraft took hits, maintained steady fire on attacking Japanese fighters. The 50-caliber machine gun, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 800 rounds per minute per gun, proved devastatingly effective against unarmored Zero fighters. A single burst that connected would often tear apart the lightweight Japanese aircraft. At typical combat ranges, 200 to 400 yards, the 50-caliber rounds retained enough energy to penetrate straight through a Zero's thin aluminum skin and exit the other side, creating massive damage along the way. Multiple hits to the engine, cockpit, fuel tanks, or control surfaces caused catastrophic failures. The Zero's complete lack of armor protection or self-sealing fuel tanks meant that damage which an armored aircraft would absorb proved immediately fatal to Japanese fighters. During the week of October 12th through October 18th, 1943, B-17 formations attacking Rabaul faced constant heavy fighter opposition. Japanese pilots pressed attacks with extraordinary courage and determination, often closing to within 50 yards, despite murderous defensive fire. But courage could not overcome the technological advantage that armor provided. American gunners shot down approximately 120 Japanese aircraft during this week of intense combat, most of them Zero fighters. Japanese pilots reported that despite making accurate attacks and observing hits, the B-17s refused to go down. Fighters that pressed attacks to close range to ensure killing hits found themselves flying into concentrated defensive fire from multiple gun positions. The kill ratio was devastating. For every B-17 shot down, Japanese forces lost 10 or more fighters. These were not lucky shots or exceptional circumstances. These were systematic tactical victories enabled by armor protection that kept American bombers flying and fighting long enough to destroy their attackers. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots was profound and cumulative. They had been trained that aggressive, close-range attacks would overcome any enemy. Their early war victories against Allied forces seemed to confirm this doctrine, but against armored B-17s, aggressive close-range attacks became suicide missions. Pilots who pressed attacks to the ranges necessary to ensure kills with their light armament found themselves being shot to pieces by defensive fire from bombers that wouldn't die. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top fighter aces with over 60 victories, mostly achieved on the Eastern Front and in early Pacific battles, later described the frustration of attacking B-17 formations in his post-war memoir. He wrote that the American bombers were incredibly tough, absorbing damage that would have destroyed Japanese bombers 10 times over. He described watching his cannon shells strike B-17s squarely, seeing the impacts clearly, but the aircraft continued flying as though nothing had happened. He described the terror of pressing attacks to close range, where the concentration of defensive fire from multiple gun positions became overwhelming. Sakai survived the war, but many of his fellow pilots did not. The attrition rate among experienced Japanese fighter pilots attacking B-17 formations was unsustainable. Japan's pilot training program, already strained by heavy losses across the Pacific, could not replace the experienced aviators being shot down over targets like Rabaul. By late 1943, experienced fighter pilots who had survived the brutal attrition were precious resources allocated carefully to priority missions. The technical specifications of B-17 armor protection reveal the engineering sophistication that made this transformation possible. The pilot and co-pilot armor consisted of rolled homogeneous steel plates, 6.5 mm to 8 mm thick, depending on location, weighing approximately 25 pounds per seat. This thickness would stop 7.07-meter rounds at any range and 20-millimeter rounds beyond approximately 200 meters. The top turret gunner's armor, the heaviest in the aircraft, consisted of 8mm to 10mm plates positioned to protect against attacks from above and the sides where the gunner was most exposed. The armor weighed approximately 90 pounds, but transformed the top turret from a death trap in early B-17 models to a relatively protected position in the B-17E and later variants. Waist gunner and tail gunner positions received 6.5 mm armor plates behind and to the sides, weighing approximately 40 pounds per position. Radio operator and bombardier positions received overhead armor protection against attacks from above. Engine nacelle armor protecting vital components weighed approximately 30 pounds per engine. The accumulated weight of all armor installations totaled approximately 1,150 pounds. The self-sealing fuel tank system proved equally critical to survivability. The tanks used a laminated construction with an outer layer of untreated rubber, a middle layer of natural rubber, and an inner layer of vulcanized rubber in contact with the fuel. When fuel penetrated a bullet hole, it caused the untreated rubber layer to swell, sealing small holes within seconds. The system could handle multiple perforations up to approximately 13 mm diameter. Larger holes from cannon shells might not seal completely, but even partial sealing significantly reduced fuel loss rates. The weight penalty of approximately 750 pounds for the complete fuel tank sealing system proved worthwhile given the dramatic reduction in aircraft losses to fuel fires. Combat records documented the effectiveness of this protection system with statistical precision that left no doubt about its value. The 43rd Bombardment Group, operating B-17Es and later B-17Fs and Gs from bases in New Guinea, compiled detailed damage reports throughout 1943 and 1944. Analysis of these reports showed that approximately 40% of B-17s returning from combat missions had battle damage, ranging from minor bullet holes to significant structural damage, requiring weeks of repair. Of aircraft receiving battle damage, approximately 60% had damage to areas protected by armor plating. In nearly all cases, the armor had prevented penetration that would have killed crew members or destroyed vital systems. Specific examples documented in unit records illustrated the life-saving effectiveness of armor protection. On November 2, 1943, a B-17G from the 43rd Group took 3 20mm cannon hits to the pilot's armored seat back. The armor stopped all 3 shells. The pilot was uninjured and flew the aircraft home. Without armor, all 3 shells would have penetrated the seat and killed him. On December 8, 1943, a B-17F took a burst of 7.8 mm machine gun fire through the top turret. 9 rounds struck the armor plating surrounding the gunner. None penetrated. The gunner continued firing throughout the engagement and was credited with shooting down the attacking Zero. On January 14, 1944, a B-17G's waist gunner position took a 20mm cannon hit that struck armor plating directly behind the gunner's position. The armor stopped the shell. The gunner was knocked down by the impact but was uninjured and returned to his gun within seconds. Fuel tank damage occurred in approximately 30% of aircraft that received battle damage. The self-sealing system successfully prevented fuel fires in over 85% of cases where tanks were punctured. The remaining 15% involved catastrophic damage from multiple cannon hits or damage to tank areas where self-sealing was ineffective, but even in these cases, the sealing system often slowed fuel loss enough to allow bombers to reach friendly territory before running out of fuel. The most telling statistic involved crew casualties. In B-17D and earlier models without comprehensive armor protection, crew casualties averaged approximately 30% per aircraft shot down, meaning that when bombers were lost, roughly 3 crew members per aircraft were killed or severely wounded. In B-17E and later models with armor protection, crew casualties averaged approximately 15% per aircraft shot down. More importantly, many aircraft that would have been lost in earlier models returned with damaged but surviving crews because armor kept them alive long enough to bring their aircraft home. The survival rate for crew members in armored B-17s was approximately double that of unarmored aircraft, a statistic that represented thousands of American lives saved over the course of the war. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing the B-17's combat effectiveness initially attributed American bomber survivability to poor Japanese pilot training or ammunition quality issues. Reports filed after the October 1943 Rabaul raids suggested that Japanese pilots needed to press attacks more aggressively and aim more carefully. The possibility that American bombers had been fundamentally improved through armor protection was not seriously considered until late 1943, when examination of shot-down B-17 wreckage revealed the extensive armor plating installed throughout the aircraft. Even then, Japanese response was limited by industrial capacity and doctrinal commitment to lightweight fighters. Japanese aircraft designers understood the value of armor protection. They had access to technical reports describing American and German armor systems captured from downed aircraft, but adding armor to Zero fighters would have required fundamental redesign of the aircraft's structure and would have compromised the very characteristics that made the Zero effective in Japanese hands. The Zero's extraordinary range and maneuverability derived directly from its lightweight construction. Adding armor sufficient to protect against .50 caliber fire would have required adding several hundred pounds to the aircraft's weight, reducing range by approximately 30%, reducing climb rate significantly, and degrading the turning performance that was the Zero's primary advantage in dogfighting. Japanese doctrine emphasized these performance characteristics over survivability, reflecting the offensive-focused philosophy that dominated Japanese military thinking throughout the war. This doctrinal commitment to performance over protection proved catastrophic as the war progressed, and Japan shifted from offensive operations where long range and maneuverability enabled aggressive attacks to defensive operations where survivability mattered more than the ability to reach distant targets. Even as losses mounted and experienced pilots died in increasing numbers, Japanese aircraft design remained focused on performance over protection. The A6M Zero variant introduced in late 1943 added minimal armor protection, a single 8mm plate behind the pilot's head, and small armor plates protecting the fuel tank. This armor was inadequate against .50 caliber fire at typical combat ranges. The aircraft also received partially self-sealing fuel tanks, but the implementation was incomplete and less effective than American systems. These modifications added approximately 150 pounds to the aircraft's weight without providing comprehensive protection, resulting in an aircraft that had lost some of its performance advantages without gaining meaningful survivability improvements. Japanese pilots flying the A6M against armored B-17s discovered that the minimal armor added to their fighters made little difference in combat outcomes. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner, a top turret gunner on a B-17G named Hell's Bell, flew 35 combat missions over New Guinea and the Philippines between October 1943 and August 1944. His aircraft returned from 28 of those missions with battle damage ranging from minor bullet holes to severe structural damage requiring weeks of repair. Warner personally was credited with 3 confirmed fighter kills and 2 probable kills. In a 1945 interview conducted for the Army Air Force's historical program, he described his experience with armor protection. "Early on, I was terrified every mission. We'd get hit, and I'd think, this is it, we're going down. But after you see 20mm shells bounce off the armor behind your position a few times, you start trusting the protection. By my 20th mission, I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. These Japanese pilots were trying to kill me and my crew, and I had the tools to kill them first. My 50 cals could tear apart their Zeros, and my armor kept me alive long enough to do it. The confidence that gave me made me a better gunner. I stopped flinching and started aiming." Warner's experience was representative of hundreds of B-17 gunners who flew combat missions in armored aircraft. Gunners who trusted their armor protection focused on accurate shooting rather than defensive reactions. This produced measurably better gunnery results as combat experience accumulated. The final accounting of B-17 operations in the Pacific reveals both the scale of the air war and the effectiveness of armor protection in improving survivability under sustained combat conditions. Between October 1942 and August 1945, American B-17s in the Pacific Theater flew approximately 20,000 combat sorties against Japanese targets across New Guinea, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Japanese home islands. They dropped over 90,000 tons of bombs on Japanese targets, including airfields, harbors, industrial facilities, and military installations. B-17 gunners claimed approximately 1,200 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, with claims roughly matching Japanese loss records after accounting for typical overclaiming from both sides in the confusion of combat. American forces lost approximately 200 B-17s in the Pacific Theater to all causes, including combat losses, operational accidents, and aircraft damaged beyond repair. This represented a loss rate of approximately 1% per sortie, remarkably low given the intensity of combat operations and the strength of Japanese opposition, particularly in 1942 and 1943, when Japanese fighter forces were still numerous and well-trained. Damage reports, compiled systematically throughout the war, indicate that approximately 60% of B-17s that completed combat missions returned with some form of battle damage. Of aircraft receiving battle damage, armor protection prevented what would have been fatal hits in over 70% of cases based on post-mission damage assessment by engineering officers who examined bullet and shell impacts. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fuel fires in over 85% of cases where tanks were punctured by enemy fire. The cumulative effect of these survivability improvements was that American bomber crews could sustain operations over extended periods, accumulating experience and tactical proficiency, while Japanese fighter forces bled experienced pilots they could not replace. The story of Japanese dismissal of American armor protection stands as a compelling case study in how technological advantages, when properly implemented and supported by sound tactical doctrine, compound into strategic dominance that determines the outcome of military campaigns. Japanese pilots who initially mocked American armor as cowardice and evidence of inferior warrior spirit discovered too late that survivability was itself a weapon, perhaps the most important weapon in a war of attrition. The bombers that refused to die, that absorbed punishment and kept flying and fighting, destroyed not just Japanese aircraft and infrastructure, but the experienced pilot cadre that Japan desperately needed and could never adequately replace once losses exceeded the capacity of training programs to produce competent replacements. What began in 1942 as engineering modifications intended simply to improve survivability ended as a strategic transformation that fundamentally altered the tactical balance of air combat in the Pacific and contributed significantly to the Allied victory that would come in August 1945.